So welcome everybody to another session of Lógicos in Quarentena. On behalf of the Brazilian Logic Society and the Logic Interest Group of the Brazilian Computer Society, I would like to thank very much Professor Tero Tulenheimo, which I'm pretty sure that I mispronounced his last name. I'm sorry about that. But
actually,
he kindly accepted our invitation to give this talk. Tero, thank you very much.
Thank you. And actually, you didn't mispronounce at all. So it's one of the few cases where it was correctly pronounced. Okay, so thank you, Petruccio and Bruno for the invitation. And so I promised to talk about this topic that I entitled Objects and Modalities, and more specifically, it will be about a certain way of formulating the semantics for quantified modal logic. So the background is that there is this problem of cross-world identity. What does it mean to say that one thing in this or this setting or this situation or this world is the same as something in another world or another scenario? And so I perfectly agree with David Lewis, who has tried to downplay this problem by saying that identity is a utterly simple and unproblematic concept, since we simply can say that everything is identical to itself and nothing is ever identical to anything else except itself. But I consider that there are two notions of identity to take into account. One is this extensional identity, for which Lewis' comment holds true, and the other is the cross-world identity across situations or across scenarios, and it is this latter concept of identity that I would like to examine, and I don't want to presuppose that it simply boils down to extensional identity or is unproblematic just because extensional identity is unproblematic. And since philosophers have famously had much disputes about what it means to quantify in a modal context, what does it mean to say that there exists something that could be something else or is believed to be something, and so forth. So since these problems exist, already this suggests that maybe this concept of cross-world identity is not utterly unproblematic. So I would like to examine this concept and try to reconstruct it in a way which does not presuppose that it's just coincides with extensional identity. So what I propose to do is to describe the situation by postulating something I call local objects that are world-bound, are reside in specific scenarios or specific worlds in this abstract sense. These local objects can be qualified or characterized by their qualities and relations that they can have to other local objects within a world. But then comes the question of identity across the worlds. And I take as my starting point that it is simply meaningless to even pose questions about identity or non-identity of inhabitants of distinct worlds. So insofar as we want to talk about, we want to give a meaning to that kind of discourse, that has to be reconstructed in some way, which will require some conceptual work. So I think it's better just to take as a starting point that we don't literally even pose the question of identity in when the things to be examined are reside in distinct worlds. And now I propose to analyze this cross-world identity in terms of something I will, following Hintikka, call world lines, so links between objects, local objects in distinct worlds. And actually I propose to view both worlds and these world lines as what could be called modal unities. They are same sorts of things. Both worlds and world lines are, so to say, collections of local objects. Worlds, let's say, partition this totality of local objects in one way. If we want to invent some term for that relation, that could be co-presence in the same cell of this equivalence relation. There will be things that are present in the same world, so to say, whereas word lines will put together local objects that are, so to say, manifestations or realizations of the same individual. So in both cases, worlds and word lines in this way of seeing things, they are collections of local objects, but they are these collections are created by different conceptualizations. But the result is that in both cases we have collections of local objects. Okay, so this is the basic idea. Now, if we look at this picture, for example, they have tried to schematically represent a collection of four worlds, W1 to W4, which have respectively two or three inhabitants, 2 or 3 local objects. For example, the world W2 has consists of 3 or has 3 local objects as in its domain, so to say. So here is we have collected together certain local objects into worlds in this way, in this thing. Then we take another figure where we have now collected furthermore certain local objects as manifestations or realizations of one and the same individual. So these lines that cross these worlds are now representations of individuals. And as we can see in this picture, for example, this individual that is represented by the dotted line is not at all manifested or realized in the world W4. So it's not supposed that they have to be manifested everywhere, but in any case, when those that are collected together represent the same individual. And now it's at least abstractly or generally, it is pretty obvious that these word lines are something over and above worlds. So no matter how much you look at the figure 1, you cannot extract information that will tell you that there will be exactly those 2 individuals that are represented in the figure 2 as the word lines. So worlds are one thing and word lines are another thing, and generally there is no reason to think that just specifying the worlds would somehow make emerge the word lines, or conversely, for that matter. So there are 2 mutually independent aspects of this modal reality, so to say. Now, some metaphysicians, like David Lewis, would nevertheless think that even if conceptually these 2 things are independent, nevertheless these word lines or these individuals somehow supervene on these worlds, so that there could be no differences with respect to the individuals unless there were corresponding differences somehow locally in the worlds. Of course, it's possible. It is conceivable that there is such a metaphysical heavy restriction that would block almost all possible ways of having individuals, because the worlds are in a certain way. But if that was the case, in any case, so combinatorially speaking, that would mean in our example that while there are 2 to the power of 143 possible selections of individuals, possible subsets, sets of individuals that one could construct upon those 4 worlds, so pretty many, only if that metaphysical viewpoint would be correct, only one selection, one set of word lines would actually be determined by the set of worlds, given the local properties and local relations that are realized in those worlds. So if this metaphysical story would be correct, at least it would severely reduce the multiplicity that otherwise there could exist, and then I can just observe that since that logically these two aspects, worlds and word lines, are independent, it will be a remarkable metaphysical coincidence if in practice the worlds would, however, always determine the word lines. And I will not, for my own part in this talk, suppose that there is such a determination, but I do consider that these are genuinely two independent aspects, and I really want to to study this and these word lines as an independent addition to the structure of modal reality. So I don't think that figure 1 could represent alone give sufficient information to fix the possibility to talk about cross-world identity. I think that in addition to the world, we must normally add information about the word lines in a way that is not even implicitly determined by the worlds. Okay, this is in any case the starting point or the background idea of this talk. Now this idea of viewing word lines in this way and then talking about them in this connection of first order modal logic stems from Hintikka, who has in 2 articles in 2016 and 1969 proposed to analyze values of quantified variables as in modal settings as world lines. But if one looks at a bit more carefully what he says there, one can detect a kind of incoherence in his motivation. He has 2 sorts of ideas associated with this idea of a word line, but they are mutually conflicting, mutually incoherent. And of course, if one associates 2 incoherent ideas with the motivations with the same idea, that can cause some conceptual problems. And I think this is the case with Hintikka. So here he is very much, very often giving it a kind of epistemic interpretation. So he talks about these word lines as some kind of methods of re-identifying a thing in different worlds. But if this is the idea, then the whole idea of the same individual is considered unproblematic, and the whole problem is the epistemic, to get to know which individual here is the same as which individual there. Of course, this is an interesting problem in its own right, but it is conceptually less fundamental than the question of how to analyze the idea of the same individual in the first place. And Hintikka himself sometimes seems to associate this idea of word line with something that we could call a transcendental interpretation. So understanding these word lines as some kind of precondition of modal talk, something that must be given before we can even start to talk about sameness in modal settings. And this is this latter interpretation that interests me, and it's the latter interpretation that is more fundamental if we want to problematize in a very strong way this idea of the identity across worlds. So my take on this idea is rather is precisely this understanding word lines as a precondition of modal talk, something that must be given before we can pronounce on anything being the same or not being the same across the worlds. And so following this idea, I will try to generalize the possible world semantics precisely in this way, that I will add these word lines as an extra component, extra information on top of worlds, and this kind of structures which contain this both sorts of information, worlds and word lines, will then be used for giving semantics for first order modal logic. Okay, so and I can in passing mention that extremely many philosophers and logicians simply deny the need of any such analysis. They take this idea of cross-world identity in the end as something more or less unproblematic. And if they talk about such things as cross-world identity, they tend to talk about it in more or less epistemic terms, in terms of what kind of how we can describe what constitutes the how can we detect the same via which descriptions can we detect an individual in different worlds, and how can we analyze the causal continuity, and this kind of ideas which are certainly related, but which presuppose, however, the meaningfulness of the idea of the same individual. We cannot talk about assigning a description to a thing in this world and in that world unless we have already the notion of that and the same individual is available, and that's something that I don't want to grant so easily. But I want to analyze this notion of cross-world identity as a primitive relation, not something that is analyzed in via some other using other tools. In passing, I may mention that actually the historically the first case of a clear distinction between what I have here been calling extensional identity and cross-world identity was by Carnap in his Logische Aufbau der Welt, where he distinguished between logische Identität and Genidentität, where this Genidentität corresponds to cross-world identity, sort of relation that would prevail among thing states, where a given thing state would be identical or logically identical only to one thing, namely to itself, but which could be gen identical to various states. So this kind of a notion of identity was proposed or discussed by Carnap, although then in his later work he abandoned it, and the whole notion, for that matter, stemmed from another person, namely Kurt Lewin, who was later more known as a social psychologist, but who did work in philosophy of science in the 20s. Given that people have so many preconceptions about identity in model settings, I think it's safer to state what these word lines are not. So some examples that one might be tempted to identify them with, but which this identification would be incorrect. So first of all, even if it will be handy and perfectly fine to model these word lines as functions, more specifically as partial functions which assign to a world a local object in that in the domain of that world, or which do not assign to a given world anything at all if that corresponding individual doesn't exist in that world or is not realized in that world. We would not really want to say that these word lines themselves are functions, because functions are abstract mathematical objects, but these word lines are supposed to represent individuals which are not normally considered as abstract mathematical objects. So, for example, my table or my desk is a sort of kind of a word line which can exist in different scenarios and settings, and which will undergo different changes following certain physical laws. And this desk is a word line, but it's not a function, even though it is associated with a function. So this is just a terminological or conceptual remark, but worth making nevertheless. So the values of these functions then, which we can use to model individuals or word lines, are local objects. These values, so I applied to W, are not individuals. This I itself is an individual, or is a representation of an individual. So we must distinguish local objects, which are values of such functions, from those functions themselves. Okay, then it is not supposed here that such functions or such word lines would always be given by some descriptive conditions. Of course, it may happen that the realization of an individual here and the realization of an individual there satisfy the same description in all worlds or in some worlds or whatnot, but this is not a part of the idea. It's not supposed that the word lines are given by some descriptive conditions. They may be, but they don't have to be. Then there is this idea that these word lines must be, a certain totality of word lines is a precondition for our being able to talk about these individuals in model settings, and in particular, it's not supposed that all combinatorially possible partial functions from words to their local object would correspond to a word line. So we cannot so easily construct the set of word lines that we just stipulate that absolutely all possible functions correspond to word lines. Not all, but only some do. So they are this totality must be given separately, and we cannot construct it in general, in particular by saying that it would be always the set of all partial functions from words to their local objects. And then David Lewis had this his analysis of identity across the worlds was based on this idea of counterpart relation. So he was precisely had this idea that this sort of cross-world identity is something that supervenes on the worlds. So these counterpart relations emerge via the local properties and local relations of world-bound things, but this is not my idea, because I don't want to suppose that always these word lines are somehow determined by the worlds, because I consider that they are a separate and generally independent aspect of this modal structure that we must take into account when evaluating model statements. Furthermore, these word lines are not identity criteria. That would be an epistemic idea, a criterion for telling which individual here is the same as the individual there, so that the individual would be in those worlds already and independently, and the whole problem would be to spot find ways of spotting this individual here and there. So that would correspond to the epistemic interpretation of Hintikka's notion of a word line, and this is not what I want to propagate. Also, these word lines are not to be confounded with Fregean senses or modes of presentation, whether they would be descriptive or non-descriptive. Again, modes of presentation are epistemic means or tools for accessing an individual that is already there, whereas here the whole point is to analyze or to try to give sense to the idea of this idea that we must take the sameness or this idea of cross-world identity as something presupposed by our modal setting, and not so we cannot start epistemically looking for things unless they are first there, and we must conceptually make them available, which according to me requires that we postulate these independent word lines, and only when they are postulated we can start talking about epistemic questions concerning these individuals. Okay, so this is now I have tried to until now I have tried to explain, motivate this approach, problematize the idea of cross-world identity, of the sameness of an individual across worlds. I have tried to suggest that in a sense worlds and word lines are same types of entities, namely collections of local objects, and I have tried to discourage identification of these word lines with all kinds of things that we know otherwise from the literature, and it's and so now all these things having been said, we should look at how to develop this idea, how to make use of these ideas in some more fruitful way, and then to sketch semantics based on these ideas. So now that we have this idea of word line, it turns out that we can actually usefully distinguish two types of word lines. On the one hand, I will suppose that each world W is associated with a set of what I will call physically individuated word lines. They are just representations, or they are what I take physical objects to be. So each world is associated with such physical word lines, and in the language I will use certain kinds of quantifiers, E reversed and A reversed, to range over those word lines, physically individuated word lines associated with a given world W. So the idea is that in W we can talk about physical objects, but they are not just merely something that is located in this world W, but they are things that can evolve over time. They can evolve. They have modal properties. They can behave different in different settings. So they must be usually are analyzed as word lines, and they are now taken to be values of this, taken to belong to this set of physically individuated word lines associated with the world W. But then again, then there are also, we have all kinds of objects of thought. We can think about things, also things that don't exist, different, and that's why we can usefully now represent or consider that objects of thought of an agent, let's say alpha, in a given word W are also to be analyzed as word lines, but this time they will be understood as intentionally individuated word lines. So they will, a priori, we can suppose that they will behave a bit differently from physically individuated word lines, but they have that in common, that they are in any case also analyzed as word lines. And to be able to talk about them in the language, I will use other sorts of quantifiers indexed by the symbol that refers to the agent in question, to then range over such word lines. So E subscript A and A subscript small a will range over intentionally individuated word lines of the agent alpha in the world W. Okay, so now potentially we have for each world a set of physically individuated word lines, and then for each world and for each agent a set of intentionally individuated word lines. Here to be noted then that both sorts of word lines are based on just one type of local objects. I'm not postulating all kinds of local objects, and just the same set of local objects, but two types of ways of creating correlations between them. One based on physical considerations, and the other based on basically the psychology of an agent alpha. This said, it is perfectly conceivable, but that a physically individuated word line, let's say I, and an intentionally individuated word line, let's say J, coincide in the sense locally. So nothing prevents two such word lines having the same local object as a value, as a realization. So they don't have to be separate in any way. They can locally, or even in the extreme case, even globally coincide. But so all that is claimed here is that there are two types of two ways of creating correlations between local objects, which both have to do with the word lines. Well, then to facilitate discussion, I will distinguish between two notions, availability and realization. I will say that a word line is physically available in a world W if it belongs to the set of physically individuated word lines associated with W. And here the idea is that the quantifiers, these physical quantifiers, will range over such physically available word lines in W. And similarly, intentionally available word lines will range over so the intentional quantifiers will range over intentionally available word lines. So this availability has to do with which word lines are available as values of quantifiers in a given world. But then there's another thing that can interest us, namely realization. We say that a local object, which is the value of a word line, is realized, is the realization of the individual. So if a local object B is the value of word line I in W, then we express this by saying that B is the realization of I in W. And when we have temptation to talk about existence in this context, by existence of an word line, we simply mean that it is realized. So if I say that a word line exists in W, what I really mean is that this word line is realized in the world in question. Okay. Then, well, we can notice certain differences between these two sorts of word lines. I take it that physically individuated word lines, those that are physical objects, for them this realization and availability are equivalent, in the sense that if an individual I is available as a value of a quantifier in W, then this individual must be realized in W. On the other, in other words, quantifying over physical individuals is ontologically committing. If I quantify over such things, then those things must exist in the sense of being realized. And conversely, if I have a word line that is realized in a given world, and if it is physically individuated, no matter in what world, starting from which world, then this individual must be available in W. That is to say, if I have a physically individuated word line that exists in a given world, then that particular word affects physical generalizations. It cannot happen that such a word line exists in a world, but is not at all its properties would not affect at all any physical generalizations expressed in terms of quantifiers. So for physically individuated word lines, these two features of realization and availability are taken to coincide. For intentionally individuated word lines, they are taken not to coincide, they are taken to be independent. So I can have an intentionally individuated word line. I can have an object of thought in the world W, even if this object in question, this object of thought does not exist. I can think of a flying horse that can be an intentional object, intentionally individuated word line for me in this world, but this does not presuppose that this word line would have an actual realization. It can have realizations in other possible worlds, but not necessarily in this possible world. So my or anyone else's object of thought need not exist. Conversely, if an intentionally individuated word line is realized in a given world, it does not in any way guarantee that I am currently able to think about it. So, concrete example, or a bit more concrete example. So, I could be thinking at a moment T1 something that would, according to my thoughts, exist at a later time T2. So, but when that time T2 becomes present, if it ever comes present, I might have forgotten the object of thought that I had at T1, and even if that object was realized in T2, it need not be available for me to think at T2. So these objects of thought of anyone, any single person, or any distinct persons, for that matter, are independent from scenario to scenario. So they can vary rather freely. So in there is not that kind of entailment either. And then I have added as a third point that certainly there are all kinds of physical objects that a given agent is not having among its objects of thought. So you can safely assume that the vast majority of physical objects in a given scenario are not among objects of thought of any given person in that scenario or in any other scenario for that matter. So there is this kind of independence of these two free features when it comes to intentional word lines, but equivalence of these features, of course, conceptual difference, but equivalence when it comes to physically individuated word lines. Okay, and now making use of this what's been said thus far, we can then devise a semantics for a language which, well, first order language which can, for simplicity, taken to be generated from predications and identities using negation, conjunction, any finite number of modal operators, and then quantifiers of two types. E reversed, standing for physical quantifier. So there, the value of the variable has to be a physically individuated word line given in the world in which we are evaluating that quantifier, and intentionally individuated or intentional quantifiers then similarly take as the values, and the variables take as values intentionally individuated word lines as fixed by the set of intentionally individuated word lines associated with that world where we are evaluating the quantifier. So that is the syntax. And now the semantics, then we will evaluate this sort of statements or statements, sentences or formulas formulated using this language by relative to structures having these 5 components: a set of worlds which consist of well, any non-empty set of worlds, each of which has been in particular been associated with a further non-empty set called the domain of this world, and that is then interpreted as understood as consisting of those things called local objects. Then the interpretation of predicates is taken to satisfy this condition that relative to a world W, n-ary predicate Q is interpreted as a certain set of n tuples of local objects of that particular world. W, so here are two things to note. One thing is to note then is that these predicates are taken to apply to local objects primarily, and not in a non-analyzed way to word lines themselves. And the other thing to note that this interpretation is supposed to obey what can be called the domain constraint. That is to say that the n tuples in the interpretation relative to W are always from the local objects from that same world W, and not from just any world. So these are the hypotheses that I have made for the semantics. I'm not I don't want to be in any way dogmatic about them. We could perfectly well consider variations, but I want to see how to develop the semantics in this way, that when we arrive at the atomic level, the evaluation takes place relative to a given world and locally, but then by contrast, the quantifiers will make genuine use of the word lines, as we will see. Okay, accessibility ratios, nothing particular to comment upon. And then we have these collections or families of which assign to each world a set of physically individuated word lines, and similarly for each world and agent, set of intentionally individuated word lines. So these sort of structures are the relative to which we are going to evaluate the semantics. Semantics is then given by explaining what it means for a formula to be satisfied: a model, a world, and an assignment. And this assignment now will have to map variables to word lines. When it comes to atomic formulas like Q, x1 to xn, there are two things to take into account. First of all, we have to check whether the word lines associated with the variables are realized in that particular word W. If this is not the case, then that is already a reason why the formula is not satisfied. But if they are, then we further check if this tuple consisting of the local objects, which result from applying the individual that the assignment has assigned to x1, the realization of this individual to W, and so on until we take the realization of the individual that G has assigned to xn, and see if that tuple of local objects happens to belong to the interpretation of the predicate. And if this is the case, then then the formula is satisfied. But so if even one of the word lines implied here is not realized in the world of evaluation, that is already a reason why this formula is not satisfied. Similar reasoning with identity, and then nothing much to say about quantifiers, except that the physical quantifiers then range over physically individuated word lines associated with the word in question, and then the evaluation goes on with the result of having modified the assignment G by so giving the as the value of x the word line I, and similarly intentionally individuated word lines are then ranging over over intentionally individuated available word lines. Okay, so quantifiers are dealt with in terms of quantification of over word lines, and atomic formulas in terms of realizations of those word lines. Well, as an example, we can take some examples of evaluations. Then let's take the formula x equals x. Under this semantics, this formula is not valid. this formula is not valid because it is possible to have a word line, let's say I, which is not realized in W, and if that is the case, then considering this I as the value assigned to X, we have an assignment which does not satisfy this formula X equals X, because to do so, there are these double conditions to satisfy. First, this value assigned to X would have to be realized in W, and then if it was realized in W, it would furthermore have to be self-identical, and that would be, this latter part would not be a problem, but the first part is in here because this particular word line is not realized in W. So that formula is not universally true, well, universally satisfied by in all assignments. There are any assignment which assigns a word line not realized in W is a counterexample. Well, then there are non-existent intentional objects. That sort of way of speaking is something that in connection with certain objects of thought we would like to be able to say, and that sort of language makes sense in this connection. So the formula there exists using the intentional quantifier X such that X is not identical to X is satisfiable. So to see this, take any word line J which is available to be quantified over in W. So belongs to the set of intentionally available word lines and is furthermore such that this word line is not realized in W, which I had expressed here by saying that it does not belong to the modal margin of J, which just means that J is not realized in W. So if we have such a word line available but not realized in W, then on the one hand, this taking this word line J as the value of X, we have found an assignment which actually satisfies the formula X is not equal to X. It does satisfy it because in effect this word line does not because the value of X is not realized in W. On the other hand, this word line is, however, intentionally available. It can be quantified over even if it is not realized in W. So it is a possible value of this quantifier E subscript A. It is possible to witness this quantifier and well, I have forgotten to read X there. There exists a X such that X is not equal to X. So it is satisfiable, this formula. There are in the case of intentionally individuated word lines, possible values of quantifiers available to be quantified over, even if these word lines are not realized in the world of evaluation, because these two features precisely were supposed to be independent, and it makes perfect sense for them to be independent. I can talk about things, talk about word lines realized in all kinds of worlds, among which, by chance, not the world in which I'm talking about this word line question. Well, then if we consider physically individuated word lines, these are in that case that same statement would be contradictory, saying that in the physical sense there exists a word line which is not self-identical. That would be not that is not possible. If we take, so suppose that was possible, then there would be a physically individuated word line witnessing this quantifier and then satisfying this assignment this word line to x would satisfy x is not equal to x, which would mean that this word line is not realized in the world W. But it was supposed that these features of physical availability and realization are equivalent for physical word lines, and therefore, if this word line is not realized in W, it's not available either, which is contradictory with the assumption that this word line was a possible witness of this quantifier. So these are some examples. One we could. I had considered presenting some extra examples about the interplay of physical and intentional quantifiers and word lines to give a bit more content to this, motivate a bit more why the two are worth distinguishing. But I guess it's better to respect the time and skip those discussions and then come to the conclusion, where to sum up, the idea was to analyze cross-world identity in terms of word lines, to consider that analysis of cross-world identity requires taking a cross-world identity as a primitive relation that must be added as an extra component in our conceptual scheme, and that was done in practice then by analyzing word lines as correlations between local objects. So that we noticed then that there was this kind of conceptual similarity between worlds and word lines, in the sense that both are sorts of correlations between local objects. And we further noticed that there are possibility of distinguishing at least two different types of word lines, namely the physical and intentional. Physical objects then are literally physical objects are in this setting analyzed as physically individuated word lines. The modal margins or sets over which those physical objects exist or are realized are simply taken to be regulated by physical laws. So physical laws tell us, if I take a physical object like my desk, if I do things to this desk, if I move it, if I make it undergo different changes, what happens to it? So in different scenarios, different things happen to it, and the totality of those things that can happen either factually over time or counterfactually over different scenarios, then constitute the modal margin of a physical object. And these are, in a sense, can be considered to be metaphysically real, and part of their reality is reflected by the fact that for them these features of availability and realization coincide. But then intentional objects are also construed as word lines, correlations between local objects, but they are agent relative. The way of structuring, the way of creating these links depend on agents, and depend, for that matter, also the sort of intentional state the agent is having. It's one thing to be perceiving, one thing to be having an hallucination, one thing of believing or knowing. The sorts of sort of intentional state at stake normally can have an effect on the sort of word line that is considered in connection with it. They don't have a metaphysical reality, but they have psychological reality. They are needed to account for also for actions that the agents carry out, because they are needed to account for the psychological states of belief, for example, of the agents, but they are not similarly conditioned by anything objective in the same way as physical objects, even though, of course, there are different psychological regularities that certainly do restrict the sorts of correlations that are possible, but not as in as strong a sense as in the case of physical objects. So now I have said something about this framework, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. So as usual, now we have some time for questions, comments. If anyone has any question, please just click on the raise hand button. Petrúcio?
Yes. Thank you, Tero, for this
Thank
talk.
you.
Yeah. I have two small questions, maybe some kind of, I'm trying to understand a little bit more about your slide 5, number 5. Is that you mentioned that you do not see any way to go from figure 1 to figure 2.
Yeah.
In this line of these lines between the worlds.
Yeah.
But is there a way to go from figure 2 to figure 1?
Well,
the dots, let's say.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're right that if we start with figure 2 as it is represented, it contains as a separate. It contains as a part of the information already what is in figure 1. So I had here. I wanted to present the figure 2 as something. As a structure that contains two sorts of information. On the one hand, certain partition of local objects giving rise to worlds, and then furthermore links giving rise to word lines. But yes, you're right. If I would have wanted to stress I could add here as a third figure. The result of taking out these worlds from figure 2 and leaving only the word lines, and that would maybe
more
it would
accurate,
be
I think,
expositionally better to explain the independence. Yes,
because you said that both concepts are completely independent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. To say to stress this independence, actually, yes, I should take out the from the figure 2 those classes corresponding to worlds, so that all that was left were those two lines, and that would then we would have on the one hand one way of putting together putting into classes worlds, and on the other hand putting into classes another way of putting into classes worlds would give rise to word lines, and then joining them would give a rise to a structure having the both. And so yes, you're right that the figure 2 is something that actually, as it stands, it represents both both aspects simultaneously, and yes.
And thank you. And the other questions about your slide 19.
9. This one.
No, 19. 19.
Oh, well.
19.
Well, which page?
19 is not the word.
Maybe I don't.
Sorry.
Yeah. So we now you're referring
19,
to which page?
Yes, 19.
19.
Yeah,
Okay.
that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
19. Yeah.
This one. Next one.
This one.
Yeah. this one. Is this correct? There are non-existent intentional objects. Should not be. There are non-identical intentional objects. Or I missed some point.
Well, this identity here is used as a device for talking about existence or realization. So the point is that if I write x equals x and I think what is the condition that the value of x has to satisfy in order for this formula to be satisfied, the answer is that this value of x has to be a word line that is realized in the world in question. So to understand this, one should not really give too much intuitive meaning to this identity here, but it is just so you can think that when I write x equals x, I'm basically saying that x is realized or x exists.
Okay. Yeah. So you consider equality as a criteria to existence?
Well, it is according to the semantics. The result is that that the only substantial condition imposed on the value of x in connection with the formula x equals x is that the value is a word line that is realized. In some other semantics, like in first order logic, there would be no substantial condition. It would be automatically satisfied. But here there is this small thing that, because if we look at the semantics here, here we in order to satisfy this formula, the word line associated with x1 and the word line associated with x2 both have to be realized.
Okay.
And that is the reason why we get this effect of saying that that the word line is realized if we just put x equals x and consider possible values. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other question or comments? Just a curiosity, is there any kind of calculus, or do you have an idea of how it reflects in a calculus?
In a caucus? Can you? I'm not sure if I understand the question. So.
Axioms and inference rules to derive the validities.
Yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah, that is an aspect that I have not myself studied, and of course it can inference systems here can become a bit complicated. Yeah, but
that was what I was thinking, that we get a bit complicated. But it's really just curiosity.
Yeah, but then it's a good question, and it is true that the first impression one has is that it must be very complicated because here is this kind of second order flavor because we are quantifying over word lines, but I have the impression that it may not be so complex as one might expect, because much of this behavior of the semantics can however be simulated on the level of local objects, but notably because the clauses for the atomic formulas are in any case in terms of local objects. But that is something that one would have to study more in detail to respond in a reasonable way.
Thank you. Cesar?
Thank you very much for your talk. It's quite interesting. I have just a small curiosity, since you mentioned David Lewis and at the end non-existing objects. I thought of Meinung. The curiosity is, what are worlds for you? Are they concrete objects like Lewisian worlds or something entirely else?
Well, I have my basic idea has been that to leave it rather abstract. So I don't want to suppose that the worlds are necessarily some complex spatiotemporally complete entities like in Lewis, but basically my view has been more like a semantic. So I take world to be anything that we might use in semantics as the so whatever we are evaluating, when we are evaluating semantic, when we take a sentence and we want to evaluate that sentence, we have to do it with respect to something, and that something is what I call world. It can be substantially speaking, it can be a moment in time, and it can be some very limited, spatially limited scenario. I don't want to. My meaning has not been to give any particular metaphysical content to it, but to take it to be any scenario relative to which we evaluate statements. So to understand it in a so then we can the meaning the idea is that we can then I leave it a bit abstract or general, and then we can I think we can apply these ideas no matter how we need to interpret concretely. If we are talking about, for example, times, how entities can evolve over time, in that case the moments in time would be worlds in this sense, and I would say that we need to have a separate notion of cross scenario or cross context or cross world cross temporal identity. So in some connections I have tried to use the word cross context identity to give the idea that I want to leave the concrete content of this idea of context or scenario open to interpretation, and I have tried to say something that I think applies no matter how we interpret it. But so in particular, I don't want to limit my understanding to anything like Lewisian worlds. I would take Lewisian worlds to be one possible interpretation of world in this sense, but I would also take just moments in time, for example, the interpretation of worlds in this sense. So any kind of scenario relative to which we can want to evaluate statements.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other question or comment? Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Tero. It was a really nice talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.